Hello, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet and you are watching a new episode of Wojennik TV. Today I would like to propose you to watch a new review, of a very important and very well-known title. It's a game which occupied the first place on Board Game Geek during several years. It's a game which I believe is known to most players, to most geeks. What is most important is that it is a war game or a political war game. It's a game that was first published in 2005, so almost 15 years ago. It is Twilight Struggle. Twilight Struggle, which was published by GMT Games, which is being regularly reprinted because GMT Games sells this game as one of its best sellers, and even when they do reprint the game, it is very rapidly sold out and they have to do a new reprint. So as I said, the game occupied the first place on the big Board Game Geek ranking during several years. Today it's not the number one, but it's still in the top 10. Something which for a war game is truly exceptional, because war games are something a little bit different than standard games. They are something really apart. It's a thing which has its own population of supporters, people who love them, but they are not always played by casual players. Twilight Struggle is, to be honest, something between a war game and a Euro game, because we have this historical political setting, but in fact when you play this game, this setting is not that war gamey as in many war games. It's not a battle played with units, it's not a battle played with corps or armies, it's a battle played with influence. You will influence gameplay, placing influence points, destroying influence points of your opponent, and acquiring points in order to control the entire world. Because this game is an epic struggle between two political blocks, the first one controlled by the United States of America and the second one by the USSR. So this will be a struggle between those two superpowers, emerging from the ruins of Second World War as the two standing powers. The game is set in the years 1945-1989, and during this period we will fight in order to gain influence in different parts of the globe, in order to accumulate victory points. We will also participate in a space race, because an important factor of the Cold War was also the space race between the USA and the USSR, ultimately culminating in Armstrong's and Aldrin trip to the moon. But further, during the 70s, 80s, this race was still on, and there will be also a space track where both players will be accumulating points and progressing in order to develop new technologies. The game is meant to be played by two players. One of them will control the USA, the second one the USSR. We should play this game in about 120-180 minutes, so from 2 to 3 hours, but it also can be a lot shorter, because the game can end with a sudden death victory of one of the players. The minimum age of a player is meant to be 13 years old, but it all depends also on the experience of this player. If this is a gaming child who has a gaming experience, it could be 12, 11 or even 10 years old. It's a game where we will be playing cards, because it's a card-driven game. So in order to play it, you have to know the language in which your edition has been published. This is an English edition, it's the deluxe edition from 2018, and it is published in English, so you should speak or read English. But there are many other editions, for instance the Polish one, Zimna Wojna. So if you are unable to play an English version, you just grab your mother's language edition and you can play it very easily. The game was designed by Ananda Gupta and Jason Matthews, and it's a game from GMT Games. Now, I would like to show you how the components of this deluxe edition look like, and then to show you how the game works. Finally, what are my final thoughts, what I think about this game, what are the reasons why this game was for such a long period #1 in the world, why is it still considered the best game ever published by so many gamers. At first, let's take a look at all the components enclosed in the box containing Twilight Struggle. It's a deluxe edition, so the components should be of the highest quality. First of all, we receive a playing board. It's a mounted board, a board representing the world. On this map, we have countries which are part of regions. Those countries, each of them, have their name, have also a stability number, a little information about its flag, and it also has the information about the connections of such a region. Those can be regional connections or interregional connections, because each region has its own color. For instance, Africa is yellow, the Middle East is light blue, Asia will be orange, and both Americas will be green. Apart from the world represented on this board, we have two superpowers. We have the USA and we have the USSR. Then we have also different tracks. Those tracks will be used during game. The first one is the DEFCON track, used to measure the level of DEFCON, and we receive a marker which will be moved on this track. The DEFCON level can be at 5, which means peace, which means no real tensions in the world, but it can decrease. It can reach the level of 2. If it reaches the final level, a nuclear war erupts and the game is instantly over. The second track is the track of required military operations during each turn. Each player will have to accomplish a certain number of military operations. The number of points of those operations will be counted on this board. Then, compared to the DEFCON status, players can win or lose victory points because of an insufficient number of required military operations. The third track will be the victory point track, used to measure the number of victory points. We receive only one marker because this marker will move on this track from 0 towards 20 when it comes to the points accumulated by the Soviet Union, or if it's the US who leads, the counter will move towards the 20 on the bottom of the track. The fourth track used during the game will be the turn round track and the action round track, where we will be measuring the number of actions, and we will also indicate whose turn it is to play. Next, we have also two additional tracks: the turn track, on which we will measure the number of turns, and we will also, at an instant look, will be able to see when different cards will enter play, because the cards of Twilight Struggle are divided into 3 different stacks: the early war cards, the mid-war cards, and the late war cards. Those cards will be added to the deck when the turn reaches a certain number. Finally, the last track will be the space race track, where both superpowers will try to take an advantage over their opponent and to move the farther possible in order to win points or additional bonuses. The second element used in Twilight Struggle are counters. Those counters are especially influence counters, which are blue and red. Blue ones are, as you may suppose it, American counters. Counters are double-sided. The first side indicates that a country is being controlled by a nation. The second one indicates that a a country, that a superpower is present in a country, but it doesn't control it. So those counters will be placed face up or face down, but their number will always indicate the number of influence points that a superpower possesses in such a country. Both nations have their own counters. We use also some additional counters in order to indicate that some events have taken place, in order to not forget then during gameplay that some effects are active. The most important elements of Twilight Struggle are cards. And as I have said earlier, we receive 3 decks of cards: early war cards, mid-war cards, and late war cards. Those cards are cards of a high quality, cards containing a title, containing a star, which indicates the number of operation points available to be used when this card is played for operations, then also an event. This event will be activated sometimes when we play our own card, sometimes when our opponents plays our card. I will explain it in just a moment. On certain cards, we will have also an information that such a card should be removed from play if used as an event. If such a card is used for operations, it remains in play. In those cards, we also have some special cards which are scoring cards. Each region in the world, for instance South America, has its own card, scoring card, which will be used during play to stop the game and to attribute points to both superpowers according to their presence, domination or control of the region. A special type of card, which is not mixed into the lot, is the China card, which will be a card at the beginning of the game in the possession of the USSR, but then when used, it will be transferred to the US, who will be able to use it, keep it, or use it or keep it. If someone keeps this card until turn 10, it is worth 1 victory point, but when used during play, it's not only a 4-operation card, it's also a card which enables us to receive an additional bonus of 1 operation point if we use all those operations in Asia. So that's a very good card, a joker, something we can use when we are desperately in need of operation points. We received 2 dice, and I must say that I'm a little bit disappointed by the fact that in the deluxe edition we receive standard colored dice, a blue and a red one. I have acquired some time ago special dice to Twilight Struggle with the symbols replacing the ones. I believe those dice are of a higher quality, they look prettier, and it's sad that deluxe edition didn't use some dice of better quality. What we also receive are 2 player aid cards, both containing the information about actions, about possible plays, about the setup, and also an information about the cards which are in the deck, if we want to see which cards have what amount of operation points on them, or what is the distribution of cards in the mid-war, in the late war, we can always look at it. Then we have the rulebook. The rulebook is a rulebook in color, prepared after so many years with many additional explanations. It's a rather easy to learn game. It's a rather well written rule book. What is worth mentioning is also that although this document is 32 pages long, it comprises also, first of all, an extensive example of play where we can see how the different mechanisms of Twilight Struggle work. Additionally, we have designer's notes part and also information about different cards used in the game. So the educational aspect of Twilight Struggle is very much emphasized in this rulebook because we have many interesting information about the background of many cards which are part of the game. That's a deluxe edition, so I will again point out something that shouldn't have taken place. Those are typos. I found some typos in this rulebook. If a game gets republished so many times, if we decide to publish a deluxe edition, we should be perfect. This rulebook is not perfect. It's an easy document to be read, but it has some typos. That's something which in a deluxe edition shouldn't take place. That's it when it comes to the components of the game. Now let's take a look how the game works. The objective of the game is, of course, winning. The main obvious way to win a game is to accumulate a maximum number of points. If there is no sudden death during gameplay, the victor is determined at the end of the last 10th turn. At this point, we compare the number of points accumulated by both players, or rather we look at the victory point track in order to see where the marker indicating the victory points is located. If it's located in the Soviet space of the track, the Soviets win. If it's in the US part of the track, it's the USA who wins the game. If during gameplay any side accumulates 20 or more victory points, the game ends in sudden death. It happens that USSR or the USA accumulate such a number of points that their advantage is 20 or more points, and at that point the game is immediately stopped and the victor is determined instantly. There are two other ways to win the game before time, not only thanks to victory points, but also thanks to, first of all, the control of Europe, and secondly by reducing the DEFCON status to a nuclear war. Now, in order to explain what controlling Europe means, I'll explain the three basic terms used in Twilight Struggle, which appear also on the scoring cards, because we will use some scoring cards in order to accumulate points. Now, the first term is presence. You are present in a region if you control at least one country in this region. Now, what means controlling a country? Controlling a country means having an amount of influence points in that country equal at least to the stability number of that country, and having a number of influence points greater from your opponent at least equal to the stability number of such a country. So here in this example, the USA controls Spain and Portugal because they have two influence points, which is equal to the stability number of Spain, Portugal, and the USSR has 0 influence points, which means that the advantage of the USA is 2 points. They have 2 points more than the USSR. If the USSR had 1 influence point in Spain, Portugal, the USA wouldn't control this country, because although they have 2 influence points, which is equal to the stability number of the country, they do not have an advantage of influence points equal at least to this stability number. So in order to re-control Spain, Portugal, they should add 1 more influence point. At this point, they would regain control of this country. So this is controlling a country. If we want to receive points for a mere presence in a region, we have to control at least 1 country in this region. If we manage to dominate in such a region, we will score more points. Dominating in a region means having more controlled countries in a region and controlling more battlegrounds in a region than your opponent. Those battlegrounds are marked with white numbers on a red square, and also the name of the country is on a purple background. So if you control more countries overall in a region and more battlegrounds, you will score points for domination. If you manage to control a region, which means that you control more countries than your opponent in a region and you control all battlegrounds in a region, you control all the region and you score the maximum possible number of points for control. If you somehow manage to control all Europe, so you first of all have more controlled countries in this region and you control all the battlegrounds in this region, you automatically win the game. But it can happen only if the scoring card of Europe is being played. So it is possible to control Europe but not to win the game if the scoring card is not played. The second way to end the game in a sudden death, apart from the victory points, is reducing the DEFCON status to a nuclear war. At the beginning of the game, the DEFCON status, the DEFCON marker is on the 5 spot, but then it will degrade, it will move right, and it can approach a nuclear war. A nuclear war is triggered when this marker would be moved one space to the right. DEFCON is degraded in case of coups made in battlegrounds and when the events on cards says we should decrease this level. What is important is that it's the player whose turn it is that loses the game when the DEFCON status reaches the nuclear war square. So it can happen that a player plays a card which triggers an event of his or her opponent, and this opponent degrades the DEFCON status, triggering a nuclear war. It's not the opponent who triggered this movement who loses, but the player who is the active one, so who played the card. How a turn of Twilight Struggle is played. At the beginning of each turn, all the players, both players, will receive cards. Cards which will be 8 or 9, it depends on the turn. At the beginning of the game, we will receive 8 cards which will be used during a turn. After the early war stack is used, when we pass to the mid war, we will receive more cards. We will receive 9 cards. The first card that we will play each turn is called the headline card. The headline card is selected by both players simultaneously. It is placed face down and then it is played by both players. The first card being resolved is the one with a higher number of operations. If in case of a tie, it's the US card which is played, which is resolved first. What is important is that during the headline phase, we look only at the bottom space of a card, so we play only the event. We do not play the operations, we do not use the operation points. After having played the headline phase, we play action phases, so both players will play cards, but they will play one card at a time. So the first one will be the USSR player who will choose one of his cards and he will play such a card. After him, the US player will play his. What can we do with those cards? So the first possibility is to activate an event. If we have a card of our own fraction, we can choose to play the event or use the card for operations. If we decide to play the card for the event, the operations are ignored. We only resolve the event. The event is being resolved and the card is being discarded or removed from play if it is a card with an asterisk. If we happen to have a card of our opponent, we cannot play it for the event, we have to use it for operations. But while we play this card for the operations, we also trigger the event. So the event will happen even if we decide to play the card for the operations. It's not up to us to choose, both things will happen. The only thing that we can choose is in which order this will happen. We can decide that the event takes place first and then we use the operations, or vice versa. So the opponent who is granted the possibility to resolve the event can make all his decisions. He can choose targets, he can place influence points granted by the event, etc. If we play such a card in order to receive operation points, we can spend those operation points in order to do 3 different things. The first possible action is to make a realignment roll. The realignment roll is done in order to reduce enemy influence in a country. So when we play such a card, which grants us some number of operations, we can make that number of realignment rolls anywhere we want on the board. The only restriction is the location of such actions due to the defcon status. If the defcon status is at 5, we can do realignment rolls where we want. If the defcon status reaches the fourth space, realignment rolls are unavailable in Europe, at 3 in Asia, and at 2 additionally in the Middle East. Other regions, for instance South America, is always open to realignment. It cannot be blocked. How a realignment works? So first of all, we choose a target. The target is a country where our opponent has at least 1 influence point. We do not have to possess any influence points in such a country. So for instance, if we would like to target Israel being the USSR, it's an eligible target, although we do not have any influence points. But what matters is that our opponent has an influence point in this country. What we do is we make a die roll and our opponent does also a die roll. Both die rolls are compared, but first modified. There are 3 modifiers used when we do realignment rolls. First of all, +1 is added for each controlled adjacent country. So if targeting Israel by the USSR, Israel, the American player, would receive 3 additional points for Egypt, Lebanon and Syria, which all are adjacent to Israel. Secondly, 1 point is added if the rolling player has more influence in target country than opponent. So in this case, the Americans would receive 1 more additional modifier thanks to the fact that they have 1 influence point in Israel and the USSR known. Thirdly, a +1 will be added if a realignment roll is done in an adjacent is adjacent to a superpower space. So here in Israel, a chance of realignment from the USSR point of view is very slim. But if we take another example, for instance, trying to do a realignment roll in Libya being the USSR, it's a little bit easier because the only modifier used to help the Americans would be the Egyptian influence points, who grant the Americans 1 additional point, whereas the Soviets would also receive 1 bonus point for controlling Libya, for having more points of influence than the Americans. So in this case, both modifiers would be the same and the die rolls would decide. The difference between the die rolls indicates the number of influence points removed from the country. So if being the USSR we would decide to liquidate this point, we would have to have at least 1 point more than our opponent in order to take care of this influence point. What is important is that realignment rolls only remove influence points from a country. They do not add any influence points. What is also important is that we can do a few realignment rolls during 1 turn, because each card enables us to do a number of realignment rolls equal to the number of operations on the card. We can choose different targets or even the same country twice or 3 times or even 4 times with a 4 operations card. A second option is making a coup in a country. It's a similar action. It also is restricted by the defcon status, but the major difference is that A coup firstly requires us to use all the operation points from the card that we have played, so we cannot choose more targets than one. The second major difference is that it not only helps us to remove influence points from a country, it also enables us to place influence, our own influence in this country. So if I were the American player and I would decide to attack, for instance, Nigeria, I could do this because there is no obligation of having our own influence points in a country in order to make a coup. In such a case, a test is being made without any modifiers. What we do is a comparison between a die roll and the number of operation points on the card that I used to make the coup. So in this example, that would be 4 plus 2 equals 6, compared to the double stability number in the country. So with Nigeria's 1, it would be only 2. The result would be 6 against 2. So the difference would be 4. The first point would be used to remove the Soviet influence point from Nigeria. The 3 others would be used to put influence points of our own in the country. So it is a very powerful action, a powerful way to remove influence points of our opponent and also to add our own. Secondly, what is important is that each coup made in a battleground country degrades the DEFCON status by 1. So we have to have this in mind in order not to do any coups when the DEFCON status is at 2. Because if we decide to do such a coup in a battleground country, we will automatically lose the game. A third way to use our influence points, to use our operation points from a card, is placing influence points on the board. Each card enables us to place a number of influence points on the board equal to the number of operation points on the card. So I could place influence points on the board firstly there where I already have some influence points, secondly in all adjacent places where I do not have any points and my opponent doesn't control those places. So I can play, for instance, here with a 2, I can place 1 influence point in Saudi Arabia, being the USA, or in Sudan, or I can add upon 1 influence point in Jordan. I could also, for instance, place a point in Iraq, or maybe I could decide to add a point in Egypt. I cannot place 1 influence point in Sudan and then place another point in Ethiopia, because Ethiopia at the beginning of my action was not adjacent to a place where I already was present. Sudan is available, but not Ethiopia, only during another card play. If I wanted to place influence points in a country controlled by my opponent, each influence point costs 2 operation points. So the first point in Libya in this example would cost me 2 operation points. But when I place this influence point, I also reduce instantly the number of points separating both superpowers in Libya. So the USSR will lose control in Libya, which means that any further influence points placed by the USA in this country would cost only 1. The last way that we can use our cards is to play them on the space track. In order to play a card, we just choose one of our cards. We only have to make sure that this card is worth at least the number required by the next track where we want to travel with our counter. So for instance, here we would need to play a 2 operations card, whereas a little bit further on the track we would need a 3. We play such a card. What is important is this card is only used on the space track. We do not activate the event, even if it's an opponent's events. So that's a way how to get rid of some nasty events which we absolutely want to avoid. This event, if present on our cards played on the space track, is totally ignored. We then make a die roll, and if we succeed, we can advance our marker, scoring some points if there are any points, or acquiring some additional capabilities if our opponent is not already present on this track. When a player reaches this space, this additional ability is cancelled. So both players will play their cards in such a way until the last turn ends, when we make a final scoring of each region. So we will check the number of points accumulated by both players. Additional points are also added for controlling battleground countries, or if you happen to control a country that is adjacent to an enemy superpower, it grants also another bonus. So that's in a very brief summary how Twilight Struggle works. There are some more rules concerning, for instance, the China card, for instance, the required military operations, but those are details that I wouldn't like to explain right now. What I would like to do is rather to tell a little bit about my opinions about this game, what I think are its strong and weaker points, and why, in my opinion, this game is considered by so many gamers and wargamers as the best game ever designed. First of all, I would like to say that I'm happy that this review has been published on our site. Twilight Struggle is such an important game when it comes to wargaming, when it comes to gaming in general, that any blog, any vlog, any site which reviews board games, which presents board games, should include this game and should have a material talking about this game. So I'm happy that Wojennik TV has this review published right now. Twilight Struggle is a game which for several years occupied the first place on Board Game Geek. It's still part of the top 10, so it's a game very highly ranked. Is this the best game? Is this the best war game ever published? I would say, in my opinion, no, because I believe there are better board games, but it is, without any doubt, a game worth reviewing, a game worth playing, and a game worth knowing. So I would like to tell you what are my thoughts about this game, what I think are its strong points, and at the end, what are the weaker points of this game, because in my opinion, it does have some weaker points. So the first very strong point of Twilight Struggle are its rules, because the rules of Twilight Struggle are both elegant and also quite easy to learn. It's a game which gives us not a big rule book with not many rules, but those rules enable us later a lot of decisions. So if a game does this, if it provides you not many rules but many decisions, it's a game with a huge depth. It's a game that I always very appreciate. It's not a classical war game because we do not have military units, we do not have armies, combat resolution tables, steps, etc. So it is a war game if we treat the Cold War and the conflict as a war game topic, which can be interesting for people not very keen into wargaming. So it's a game somewhere between, and this is maybe one of the reasons why this game was and is so popular. Because you know how it is when it comes to war games. Many people hearing a war game will just say, oh no, thank you, pass, I'm not into wargaming. Those games are blocks, hundreds of units, very complicated rulebooks. It's true when it comes to some war games. There are also many war games, easy to learn, quick to play, quick to learn. But there are many others which are monster games, and those are complicated and very non-appealing to non-war gamers. Twilight Struggle is very different. It's something between a Euro and a war game, so it It's something which will suit both wargamers and casual players, and that would be the reason why this game is so popular. The rules are written in such a way that they are very easy to understand. The mechanisms are very elegant. The way that the cards used in the game is also very elegant. It enables great decision making, because those cards are all that you need in order to play. With those cards you have to make decisions how to use them, activate the event, or maybe use influence points. But attention, because if you have an opponent's card, you will activate the event. So you have to carefully plan. You will plan ahead, but also you will always change your plans and adapt if your opponent plays something which destroys your earlier plan. So the game is something with a huge palette of options. It's also a game with a huge replayability, because each game will be different. At the start, you choose where to place some influence points. Then you have the cards which are randomly distributed. Furthermore, you have different scenarios, because you can start the game at a later period. So each game will be different, because each turn, each card play will change the outcome of the game, and it's up to the players how they will shape the world in which the struggle takes place. I must say that a very strong point of Twilight Struggle is its educational value, because the game is set in the period of the Cold War, and it can really well teach you this period. First of all, while playing the game, you will better understand how the struggle between those two superpowers happened during those difficult years. Secondly, you can access firstly the card, which will sometimes explain by the way they work what was the rationale behind them. So if you see a card with a title, for instance, Quagmire or Kitchen Debates, and then you see the picture and then the effect of the card, it's very easy to understand that it's something that gave influence to the US or gave influence to the USSR, or maybe it could give such influence to both superpowers. And secondly, you have also the rule book, where you have many of those cards very well explained with some text, some historical additional information, so you can read them, you can learn a lot about the period of the Cold War. Is this game balanced? Because it is one of the issues, it is one of the problems which many gamers state, which many gamers say about Twilight Struggle. I have heard different opinions, but the most common when someone says that the game is not balanced is that it is much more difficult to win with the US. So how is it in reality? I would say that there are two levels of balance in this game. If we play the game with a beginner, if two beginners play the game, I will say the game is not quite balanced, because in my private opinion it's easier to play with the USSR. The Americans have to fight through the first early war period, and they have to survive in order to strike back at the end of the mid-war, and then to take the upfront during the late war period. But if you play with an experienced player, if two experienced players play this game, the game is very well balanced, because both players will exactly know how the game works. They will know how to maximize the effects of their cards. They will also be fully aware of the way how the game works during its late stages. So they will know the cards, they will know that first of all it's the USSR who has more powerful cards, but then this situation can change. So in my opinion the game is balanced, but if we play it knowing the game, if we play it with experienced players. If we play with casual players, it will be less balanced than it could be. What I find is a very strong point of this game too is the fact that it enables some epic situations, because some situations during the game are truly epic. I have seen a game in which one of the players had 18 points or something, and then during a few, thanks to a few card plays, he managed to score a lot of points, and finally at the game end he won by 1 point. So this game is not a highway to winning. Even if you have a huge advantage, you can lose it with some good card plays by your opponent. So this game is sometimes like a real roller coaster, because if playing with the USSR you are unable to win with a sudden death during the first period of the game, then probably you will lose some points at the game's second part. The game promotes experience, so experienced players will almost always win against a beginner or someone who doesn't know how the decks are composed, what cards to weight in the decks. But it is also a game very easy to teach. So even if someone loses his first game due to sudden death, the second game should be a lot better, because he will better know how the mechanism works, how the mechanisms work, how to use the cards, and where to focus your attention. So what are the weaker points of Twilight Struggle? Because at the beginning I said that there are some weaker points which should be mentioned. I already told you about my opinions about game balance, so I won't repeat this. But a second issue which can be a problem during some plays in Twilight Struggle is its randomness. There is a randomness due to the fact that you will always use cards. Those cards will be randomly distributed, and sometimes you will receive very, very bad card hands. You will receive many cards associated to your opponent, and even if you keep a card, even if you send one card into the space track, you will get stuck with so many bad things, so many bad cards, that ultimately you will lose some points, or you will lose some precious influence points somewhere in the world. So this randomness can influence a little bit gameplay, and it can be also frustrating from time to time, especially if you receive some low influence cards and your opponent gets good events and huge and high influence cards. Then I would say that another thing which should be mentioned is the fact that it is a game with a historical setting which is really felt during gameplay. So people who do not like history, who do not like politics, can be less satisfied with the game than people who like these topics. It's not an issue, it's not a big problem, but it is something that can diminish the pleasure of playing when it comes to some players. But concluding, Twilight Struggle is a great game, very well designed, a game still very up to date, a game which is still relatively fresh when it comes to the way how it works. It has 15 years, but it is still something that stands out when you are searching for an interesting game, a crossover between a Euro and a war game, because it is a game that can suit absolutely everybody, and I believe it is one of the strongest points of this game, one of the reasons why it is so highly ranked and so popular in the world. That was Twilight Struggle from GMT Games. Thank you for watching this review. I hope you will join us during further materials. I hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.